So welcome everybody to Tama Talks. Today's talk is our third in a series that we have done every Friday in February. And we are joined by Max Presneill, an artist who is also the director and curator of the Torrance Art Museum. And Max will share his insights on the work of the artists that we are highlighting during these Tama Talks on Fridays and answer questions from anyone tuning in. And so along those lines, you are more than welcome to keep your audio. We'll probably have your audio off just to keep the background noise down to a minimum, but feel free to either use the raise hand feature or work inside the chat if you have questions, and I'll do my best to monitor that while the discussion is going on. My name is Janine Madden. I am the Tama president, and I would like to thank our treasurer, Patrice Lefevre, for suggesting a closer look at the work of Wassily Kandinsky. Kandinsky is a favorite of the Torrance Adventures in Art program that Patrice has some strong ties to, and the docents due in part to his emphasis on color theory, which we will talk a little bit about today. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I try and give some links, and I'll put this link in the chat. There's a .net and a .org. Both of them have quite a lot of data on him, on Kandinsky. So I'm going to provide a very short biography only because we really want to be able to let Max get into a good discussion with us before our time ends. Wassily Kandinsky was born in Moscow in 1866, and his family was quite wealthy. He was very well educated, learning to play the violin at a very early age. So musical influence was very prevalent in his life. He went to college in Odessa and actually became a law professor and taught in 1896. After he was married, he went onto a tour of Russia where he was exposed to Russian folk art, also to the work of Claude Monet, and particularly his haystacks, which he, in the literature that you're reading about him, he was kind of fascinated about it. He was a bit confused by it, considering it a bit unfinished, and wrestling with that impression of a haystack, that impressionist view of a haystack rather than the realistic rendering of one. He did decide later in life to become an artist, leaving the law behind, but not the teaching part. And he traveled to Munich, where he attended the Academy of Fine Arts and met Gabriel Munter, with whom he traveled to Europe. And they ended up in Murnau, Germany, where he joined the Blue Rider, actually joined and I think was one of the founding members of the Blue Rider group with several other artists, including August Mack and Franz Marc. And so I'm going to switch to that slide. And Max, did you want to talk a little bit about the Blue Rider group?
The only thing I want to say about them really is it's because it's kind of disappeared from current conversations. It's really easy to dismiss or forget how influential they were. In early developments of 20th century modern art, the Expressionists were an influential and significant grouping, and there were several groups, but the Blue Rider was probably one of the most influential and important out of those, and so is worth kind of looking into if you have interests in the difference between Expressionism as it in its early developments and how we use the term now, because of course abstract expressionists came along in the 50s and kind of changed the way we kind of view the word. But there is this this focus on the inner emotional states of human beings, etc., which was a first at the time. I mean, it was an original take on some things at the time, although it did have precedences that were out there in the world before that. It was an influential movement and certainly worth investigating.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's a small photo just of, and Kandinsky's in the front there of that group. And the name was derived from the earlier painting that he had done in 1903. And so it's a significant painting because it really is quite, it's quite a, not really a departure. Obviously, it was the beginning of his painting career. And so we are going to move on to this next piece because the Blue Rider group, where he is riding a horse. Let me see where I am. So for those of you who have your audio on, open, and would like to contribute, feel free, or you certainly can just type into the chat. But just at first glance, what do you notice about this piece?
You know, one of the things I find really interesting about his work, particularly this, there's a long period of his work, is it's amazing how right-handed he is. All of his paintings have that movement when he's applying the paint. Up until the later geometric works, but he always has this kind of very very present kind of mark making gestural movement of his hand.
Yeah.
It's not from the elbow like an abstract expressionist might do it, but there's kind of like this where you can really see the hand, the handy work going on. It's really, really telling in his work, very stylistically identifiable.
Sam commented in the chat that line is dominant in the composition, and Candy added the colors. Leslie said more abstract with the use of negative space and high contrast. And so although the piece is titled Improvisation number 20, it is of two horses. And so as you look closely, I guess that small right-handed line work, as you call it, can maybe be deciphered in their manes.
Yeah, you can see the right foreleg of the horse is on the bottom right in black. You can see its head in the midpoint on the right-hand side.
So this area.
And it's being ridden. I mean, you know, it's an interesting thing because Kandinsky is one of the few, well, maybe one of the few artists where you can literally track a development painting by painting by painting throughout a long course of years. But the stages of his life, what he was looking at, the influences in his outside life are very, very apparent. And this is abstracted, but it's not abstract in the sense of being unrepresentation, because it is representation. There's a horse, maybe two horses and two riders. And so it really is at that stage between experimenting with how far the artist can go without losing the sense of meaning, which would have been which is why Picasso couldn't take the step himself. But it's interesting to see that he's exploring how far he can go. But we have to remember that there's that stuff that's going on around the world, the dialogue, the discussions artists in his circles would have been having are going to impact how he develops this, and the courage needed to take the step into pure abstraction. And I think that there's several key elements. I'm going to go on here for a second.
Please do. Do you want me to move to the next slide when you talk about the progression, or keep it?
No, it doesn't really matter. I think the things to remember that I think are significant are his own fascination with music. If you guys are familiar with synesthesia, which is when you can hear sound, you can hear colors and see sounds and this kind of weird relationship, it's really important to recognize that it's thought that he was probably a synesthete, and that when he's painting, the shapes and the colors are equivalents to music. This is Schoenberg and Stravinsky and jazz, jazz later, that are ways of thinking about what's going on. So it's on one side, it's this set of attempts to get to essentially a spirituality, an inner, as he called it, an inner necessity, and that inner necessity to express oneself to the, and in his case, towards the aims of a form of spirituality. Now, he was both a devout Christian, Orthodox, but he was also a member of the Theosophic Society, which is, if you guys don't know about it, you should read about it. It was very influential with Mondrian and some other artists. It's also kind of crazy religion. It's very odd. It's a very kind of weird amalgamation of all these kind of different religions with, you know, hidden societies and this kind of these celestial beings that influence, you know, come down and live on the earth and all sorts of other things. I mean, it's also a society that is very open, so it has a lot of different beliefs even within itself and branched off. But it's important because his book on the spiritual in art is attempting through the book, through his writing and through his painting, to attempt this synthesis of music, spirituality, theosophy, religion, and trying to bring these things together. And it's a very common aim at that time. So, you know, it would have been on the cutting edge, but he would have also, it would have been a discussion it was having amongst other significant artists of his own time. And if the other side of this coin, which I think is really important, is you have to keep in mind some of the things that were going on intellectually in the world. The influences of Freud in understanding that there is this inner world and what that might mean. It would have been a dominant conversation amongst a lot of artists with the ego and id and what all this might have meant. And to kind of balance that in some ways, Einstein's theories, these are both from the early 20th century, would have been a common discussion about what reality is and might be. And then in terms of art, you've got Fauvism being, the liberation of color through Fauvism being very apparent in his work and in his earlier work. But more importantly, and I think this is super, super important, maybe the most important thing, is Picasso and Braque and their contemporaries, their development of Cubism is dependent on the idea that what counts is not what the eye sees, but what the brain understands and thinks and processes. So it's about a form of mental perception as opposed to a visual one. And Cubism as a movement reflects the idea that mind is more important in staging reality than what you're actually seeing is. Now, the logical outcome of Cubism is abstraction, because if that's the case, then it doesn't need reference points necessarily to be any less true. And I think Picasso wouldn't go there. Some artists, and I don't believe, because he's often thought of the grandfather of abstraction, I think there were people doing it before him. You know, there are a number, Delaunay, for instance, were experimenting earlier with pure abstraction than Kandinsky was, I believe, and some other artists. But I think it's really important to understand that this essentially comes out, like most things do in art, come out of the developments of Cubism, but within a world where the world's being disrupted by all these ideas about psychology and science, and you know, there's now a thing that can fly called an aeroplane in the early 20th century, and there's cars running around and cinema, and there's all these things that are changing the world drastically for somebody like him who was born in the 1866 or whatever. And so the excitement, I think, being felt by artists in this new world can be reflected in what he does as a painter in his experiments and his need to see a unification of diverse kind of positions and ideas that were bouncing around everywhere at the time.
The one thing you were saying about the theosophy, that not necessarily a definition, but defined sort of as eternal truth. And he referenced it in his work. Let me go back here, on the spiritual in art. I have it written in my notes down here, so I'll try to change slides. But I'll put a link to that document in the chat, because I started reading it to prepare for today, and was really struck by this idea that creating art for people to buy it or to people to own it was really the exact opposite of what he wanted. And he really was after this sort of spiritual experience in his work, and the idea that the use of color and shape, that each color had a spiritual sort of designation to it. And like you were saying, including it with the music, that there was a way to interpret that. I thought one of the most interesting quotes that I came across regarding the theosophy was by H.P. Blavatsky, who wrote a sort of catechism. She wrote a sort of catechism about theosophy. And one of the quotes she said, this would have been in the 1900s, in the 21st century, Earth will become heaven compared to what it is now, which is so weird to be reading because here we are in the 21st century. So,
yeah, the kind of founder, Madame Blavatsky, is an interesting historical character to kind of have a quick look at. It's quite strange, but worth a read on Wikipedia or something.
sure.
I would say that this whole idea of synesthesia, which is something that I don't think that they wouldn't have been aware of in their own time, particularly, it is something that's a development, medically a development that's much more recent, that we understand that exists, and we have a name for it now. And there are a number of artists in the world, like Marcus Lutyens, who works with that, with synesthesia and with synesthetics. And it's really interesting, but at the moment, in the last sort of decade, it's quite cutting edge in art that people are doing stuff with this. But there is a thing that I came across that, you guys, if you want to see, if you're interested in Kandinsky and this idea of synesthesia, I will put this in there. You have to see this thing. It's an attempt to link via Kandinsky's own writings, colors to shapes and sound. And they do it online, so you can go on and it'll tell you about Kandinsky, and it'll tell you about that relationship between how he saw, like, yellow sounds like a trumpet, as an example. And it has this kind of emotional meaning. And it actually does that, so you can kind of press your cursor onto different colors and it interprets. It's a wonderful attempt to give meaning to how Kandinsky might have seen these paintings, or at least how he would have heard his own paintings.
Right, that's what the key is how he would have heard them. And I think, like you were mentioning Schoenberg, I think that there is a musical piece out there that's closely associated with the Kandinsky work, and I needed to make that a little more clear to myself in my notes. But if you're searching out there, and again, we talked about this a little bit before everything started today, we don't spend a lot of time, and we could spend a semester talking about this artist, but we don't spend a lot of time. And so really what these little Tama talks are designed for is to really just ignite a spark, just an interest in an artist that you maybe thought you knew before. This piece that we're going to go on to next, Patrice will know, because it's a color study that was used in Adventures in Art. And probably one of the more recognizable pieces that we see out there, even though it was just both of them are just color studies. But yes, there's a lot out there, and almost anywhere you search. So I noticed when Max put a link into the chat, and for those of you new on Zoom, when you click that, it's a link. So it will open up your browser, and it will open up in the browser. And what will happen is when I close the chat, it will go away. So feel free to click on that and then just minimize your browser so that you have it open in a window so you can take a look at it afterward. All right.
you know, it's interesting because it's easy to look at these and just say, well, yeah, they're color studies. But if you're synesthetic, this is an exercise in music at the same time, as well as visually, and also as somebody that was interested in the spiritual aspects, these shapes would have meaning. That the like supreme shape is some kind of egg or circle shape
Yes.
that leads to some kind of a higher spiritual plane. I'm an atheist, so these kind of things don't resonate very well with me. But I think it's really interesting that that people are drawn to these analogies between shape, color, and idea. I mean, there are Platonic forms. There are the idea of shape having meaning, and that's always been the case with human beings. So it's not a new thing. This is something that human beings have always done and always associated with. And I think it's really interesting that whatever it is within the animal that causes this is a really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit too with Rothko and that spirituality. And I have a few religious type pictures that he did also, that Kandinsky did. The note that I have on this slide is that for Kandinsky, color meant more than just a visual component of a picture, that color was its soul. And in his writings, he described his own perspective on how colors interacted with each other and with the viewer in detail in a very poetic way. And that he could, as Max was saying, as a synesthete, how do you say it? Synesthete?
Synesthete.
He could hear color and see sound. And do you remember, Max, in Gallery 2, you had an exhibition that were songs but painted? Because I feel like there was a Prince song, and it was. Do you remember that?
Yeah, we've done shows that incorporate that, and we've shown Marcus Lutyens with his work before, who, like I said, deals with synesthesia all the time.
Okay, so now I'm trying to do this as it was 426. I tried to do this in somewhat of a chronological order. So these two pieces, this composition number 6 that he did in 1913, I'm just going to read to you what I have on this piece. From nearly 6 months of study and preparation, he had intended the work to evoke a flood, baptism, destruction, and rebirth simultaneously. After outlining the work on a mural-sized wood panel, he became blocked and could not go on. And Gabrielle Munter told him that he was trapped in his intellect and could not reach the true subject of the picture. She suggested he simply repeat the word Überflut. I hope I'm saying that right. It is German for a deluge or a flood, and focus on its sound rather than its meaning. And so Kandinsky repeated this word like a mantra and completed this work in a 3-day span.
It's interesting that his spirituality and his Christian background often come together in a lot of the works being referencing ideas of the apocalyptic. This is a common theme amongst the compositions and improvisations. I think it's really interesting that he's still, and also the other thing, of course, is if you look at things like Turner and John Martin's landscapes, which are these apocalyptic visions, you can see these kind of similarities, even though it's abstracted to a large degree. It has a similar tumultuous, epic scale and dark and light playing off of each other really strongly. I think you can kind of see. You guys familiar with Turner's rainstorm paintings? You know, with the ship at sea. You know, those kind of things. And if you don't know John Martin's work, he was a landscape painter of apocalyptic scenes. Look them up. They're quite awesome. You know, epic. They're like Lord of the Rings for painters.
Wonderful, wonderful. And again, that's part of this. When you referenced that apocalyptic piece on the theme of the Last Judgment, kind of came to mind, and I knew I threw it in there because I know that his feeling in my research, it was saying that his feeling, his comparing the spiritual life of humanity to a pyramid, that the artist has a mission to lead others to the pinnacle in his work. And the point of a pyramid is those few great artists, this idea of advancing and ascending slowly, even if it sometimes appears immobile.
Well, he did always refer to the artist as prophet. I mean, the artist fulfills a religious, shamanistic role in society. I mean, he did have, he did believe that the artist was a specialist, not specialized, was a privileged position of truth that could lead the rest of, I don't know, everyone who doesn't understand.
Sure. Through the work, like through looking at the work, he felt that he as an artist could reveal that perhaps to us as the viewer.
There's a certain, I mean, that's an immensely problematic position. I would refute it, and it's also amazingly narcissistic.
Sure, sure. Expand on that a little bit, because I know that you have a very strong feeling about spirituality in work and the idea of art bringing us to a spiritual place when we look at it.
I guess the problem I have is the word, what does spiritual mean? Sure. And I don't mean in common parlance when we're just throwing it around. I mean intellectually, what does it mean? And in a Wittgenstein kind of way, if we can't come to an agreement on the language used, then the language has no meaning. Sure. And as far as my position on this is much more along that it's so loose a term that it's essentially meaningless. And I also have doubts that because the human brain is capable of convincing itself of anything, as we can see in politics, that we should trust that just because somebody thinks that they're reaching nirvana, that means they are. I'm not convinced.
Sure. Sure.
I'd like to actually talk, Leslie. Yeah, it says a feeling of light. What does that mean? I'm looking out my window. I'm getting a feeling of light. Is it spiritual? My response would be
a physical lightness, something that emanates from within and out, a shining feeling.
Okay, so let me point this. Is LSD hallucinations spiritual?
Yes.
So drug taking can be, or is a spiritual experience because it changes the subjective experience.
I guess that would depend on if you had a good experience with it or you had a bad trip or something.
Oh, so only good experiences are spiritual, bad experiences on drugs or something else?
Never thought about it. Interesting conversation. I will confess, I did grow up in the 70s in New York.
So where does that place?
Spirituality is something, in my concept of what it is, it's to uplift people, give hope, to embrace others in a give and take of goodness is for in my humble definition of what it means to me. And I do think artists, being an artist is something spiritual, but that's my own belief.
Sure, and everyone is entitled to those kind of beliefs. What I would say though, is if we got everyone that's listening to this right now, and if we had 3 different answers, then there's a problem in terms of intellectually understanding what the concept is. Because if we all have different expressions, then we're not, the word has no meaning.
Right.
what it
Because
means.
red is red, and there's no denying that, right? I mean,
No, there
color
is.
red is,
Intellectually, there are ways of denying red is red, but
See?
let's not get into that, because then
Right,
then we
right.
start talking about the, you know, to what degree can we know anything out of the subjective experience?
right.
Um,
One of the things you had talked about when we talked about preparing for today was to make sure that we included his, you know, so you were mentioning, including his return to Moscow. And so you were mentioning that there's a lot going on in the world during the time that Kandinsky was painting. And so he painted during two wars, which was significant, I think, you know. To
You know,
paint during the First World as a Russian, and returning to Russia after the war, leaving Germany and returning to Russia after the war, and how some of that work, how some of his feelings about that were reflected in his work during that time.
well, hold on, because he went back to Russia at the start of World War I think, not the end. I
yes.
believe he was with the Blue Rider group in Germany, went back to Russia because of the war in 1914, and then stayed there until 1921 when he went back to Germany. What's interesting, there's a couple of things I think are really important. He was very politically active, and you know, this was part, you know, tumultuous times, but he wasn't on the kind of edges of this. He was involved in this because he was actually he became a director and or founder of several movements and organizations. If we understand that he went back to Russia, he's in Russia, Russia's going through this change in terms of the Bolsheviks and into communism and Stalinism, a better term than communism perhaps. But during this period, of course, there's this idea from him and artists like him who think art has the power to save the world and to lead it to freedom. And there's the Communist Party and the Bolsheviks and the Stalinists and everybody else, Leninists, going, we're going into the future and it'll be about us together, and it's about the people. And at some point there becomes a really important disjuncture where the artist's utopianism is being rejected by the political powers, saying, well, if you're not showing us, you know, the wonderful workers leading forth into the future with optimism, and that's our truth, that creates a tension, which in turn rejects abstraction in the same way as the Germans did with degenerate art, as not sublimating itself to the need for the political need. And this is a big break, I think, in with one of the interesting breaks, if you like, between art and politics in the past, because art and politics keeps doing this constantly over time, as it's doing at this present moment, but it keeps running into these divergent moments where one rejects the other and vice versa. And I think it's really interesting that while he goes back to Russia, it becomes increasingly untenuous to be able to continue in what he believes and through his artwork. And so he goes back to the Bauhaus in 1921. And the Bauhaus's aesthetics and belief systems influence him yet again, doing what he does, but to become immensely geometric, that you can formalize everything, that there's some way that you can literally get down to, you know, the nuts and bolts of understanding art and spirituality. And it's a really interesting design take on creating, you know, painting.
Yeah, because he goes from, you know, what we were looking at above here to this when he gets to the Bauhaus. And this,
again, you know, the influence of people around him, his engagement with the ideas of his time and circumstances. You know, both of those things are evident in his work, which is, you know, I actually think this is a really good thing, that you can see somebody who's not only, you know, wandering down the rabbit hole, but is in a constant engagement with the world they live in, the ideas that are percolating around them socially, politically. You know, that they're obviously seeing this. It's not a career move, it's experiment, it is investigation. And, you know, and for me personally, that's really what art should be about. You know, the monetary side's great for some people, and the art market's this thing over here. But then, the real nitty gritty of it is to follow this engagement with the world and reflect it through, whatever kind of art form one makes.
Okay. This was done in 1923 when he was still at the Bauhaus. And this piece was done in 1925. Yellow, red, and blue. And so it's almost, to me, seems like a meshing of that earlier color theory with the Bauhaus idea of line and form and those fundamental things of art, where he's including them all on this piece. And to me, this piece has a musicality to it. And I'm not sure if it's just the lines that are very staff-like for me. I'm not really sure, but it's just an extraordinary piece. All right. Again, go ahead.
I mean, towards the 30s, you can see his work moving increasingly towards, the great synthesis, where he's bringing together all of those periods in his past life into one thing. So it's obviously geometric, but it's now also including some of those aspects from earlier on. Before that, the wiggly line, for instance.
Yes.
The paint application itself is coming back with these areas where you can see the hand back in them, away from the geometric areas where he didn't really, it's more about flat color as a general statement. So I think that's really interesting that he's, bringing back, as it were, the biomorphic forms and combining them with the geometric ones. So it's Bauhaus meets expressionism.
Yes. And this piece I included, it was done in 1928, only because when I look at it, it seems very Cubism-esque, but maybe not, because I don't know if it's just the color or the overlapping, but what are your thoughts on this piece?
I think that, it's really hard to look at art from certain periods without seeing Cubism in it. Okay. Just as a general thing, for me, it's really difficult not to see it everywhere, particularly in early modernist works. But he's still working with the idea of circles and basic forms like Platonic forms, which uphold, is perfectly in line with his entire trajectory as an artist.
Okay, I have a few more images I want to share.
I don't know if everyone here is familiar with Hilma af Klint, who's attracting lots and lots and lots of attention right now. But her work essentially comes out of a very, very similar approach. I just put a little link on Wikipedia to her. But you might want to kind of do some more, like go onto Google and look at some of her images, because it's really funny, because it's not like she was unknown in her own time or unconnected, but she certainly has resurfaced to the art world at the moment. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. The paintings are great. I saw them in New York a few years ago, and they're fantastic. Whether I agree with what they're doing or not is a different matter, but as abstract paintings, they're fantastic.
Terrific, thank you. And so again, that's a link, and if you click it, it will open up in your browser. So now we're in the 1930s. Again, in selecting the work, for me, a lot of it is just that whole idea of color and line and how he puts it all together on the page. And maybe just, again, this idea, if you look at this piece and then you look at this next piece. So when I look at this piece, then I just think Matisse. So, and I don't know if it's just the shape or I'm not really sure, just that whole idea of cut pieces, or it's just where my mind goes when I see it.
Every time, having talked to a lot of artists, about their studio practices. I think a thing that I've seen again and again and again, I've been told about again and again and again, and I've experienced again and again and again, is that when there comes significant points where a redirection is needed, then those periods you see the artist jumping around a bit, combining, going off on little cul-de-sacs of thought, while they kind of assessing where that next move might go, because they might have it percolating somewhere in their head, but they still need to be doing something while it percolates. And you can see this kind of, well, let's go to an extreme here, let's go on the opposite extreme here, let's combine these until something formulates itself well enough. You say, this is the new area that I know has an avenue I need to explore. And I think this period before, well, it's 34 here, which means he's made the move to Paris. He left Germany because of the Nazis, moved to Paris. But I think that knowledge that socially he was in Germany, where there'd been all this excitement and the problems of DJ, but he's now leaving Germany because of this whole thing with the cultural approach becomes about degenerate art and problems with the officials and and politically. So he leaves the country, and in that relocation, I think you see a relocation perhaps of what he needs to do as an artist. And so there's this moment of indecision, of playing, if you like, which then leads to this final period of 10 years in his life, where he brings everything together that he recognizes as important to him as an artist.
What I think is very interesting too is on either one of those websites, when you look at one of them, I think the .net website lists his work in a given year as a link. So if you clicked 1938, what I found most startling was the fact that it wasn't like a whole year of Monet's, meaning that, you could look at it and say, okay, I can tell who this is by. It was just this idea that they were so different. So the difference between these two, and granted there's 2 years between them. I think this is 1942. So if 1940 also. So if you look at this piece and you look at this piece,
I'm not sure I see those as being that different.
These two.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see.
They're
And that's the one. That's the last. That's the last one of the last pieces. So
they're both working with this kind of layout, which suggests taxonomies, this investigation of things and the way that they're being presented. And I think you can see, these kind of, well, I have an idea now of some of the things I'm using. Now what is the method of presentation? It's less of an investigation of the shapes and forms and colors, and more about how do I present this? How do I visually present it? And so, because this one and the other one you just showed are all about the presentation. Where is it located? Its relationship is nearly textual in how it's being laid out. The last one, like on a fishing, like on a laundry line or something, it's being placed before you, or music. This is like how music's written. I think that the focus has shifted on a few of these towards that end. Like, I know what I know, but how am I telling you?
sure. I want to go to this last piece because I want to save some time for folks to ask any questions that they might have. But the way that I have this described on the slide is biomorphic extraction, and painted in the year that he died. In relative obscurity, his reputation damaged by the incorporation of his work in that Nazi degenerate art exhibition in 1937. And so that transition from Germany to Paris was a difficult one. I've read, because he was not necessarily accepted by the Parisian art viewing public, while he may have been by some of the more elite art aficionados, not by people who would purchase his work.
well, there is this thing between, well, how much, if you separate, well, how did his market go? If you separate that out and we look at, well, because I mean, remember, modern art in these early years wasn't a phenomenon it is today, where we pay attention and we get the auction prices and on regular, on news channels. This was a small world with very few people actually engaged with it overall. Prices were low. Would the question would be, realistically would be, was he known and influential or admired by his peers? Did Picasso know of him? Did the Parisian scene know about the Moscow and Berlin scenes? Absolutely, without no doubt at all. The crossover was huge and documented. Would in his sphere as an artist, would he have been a respected and highly thought of? Absolutely. I mean, anything outside of that, because there were a lot of artists and who weren't household names, but would be considered successful. And the other side of the coin, of course, is if you were in the degenerate art show, that was a career enhancer long term and across the board. I mean, everyone that was in that was like, oh, good, you're anti-Nazi. That must be really good.
Sure. So again, this is if not the last, one of the last pieces that he did, he did die in 1944. So we have about 10 minutes, a little less left, and I would love to open it up to any questions anyone has. I can go through any other slides, anything that you have for Max about the artist, about the work. This is your time. We have him for a few more minutes, so feel free to unmute.
Just to make it very clear, I am not a Kandinsky expert in any way. He is an artist I looked at a lot when I was first entering into, becoming an artist myself. And, you had to be aware of him and Klee and Matisse and Picasso and all these others. So it's like a grounding in your education, I believe. And it's good for any artist to understand, or at least have, engage with Kandinsky in some ways. But I am not an expert in Kandinsky by any means.
Yeah, that's a disclaimer we both probably should say at the very beginning of this, in that we took the recommendations, these first set of Tama talks, we took the recommendations of the board. And so at a meeting, we just said, let's pick some artists. And this is who we came up with. And so it is not based on any, obviously it's based on what we found out there and what we wanted to present today. And so if there are artists that you have Sam offered a few earlier. And so if you have artists that you would like for us to explore, please let us know. You can put it in the chat. You can send us an email. I made a special slide for Max this time. I know, it's such a great pick. But thank you for joining us, because we really do appreciate the fact that you take the time out to chat with us and explain your perspective. It really does mean a lot. Next week, we are going to feature the work of Jackson Pollock. And so we are so appreciative of you joining us today, and we hope that you will be back next week. As a reminder, the Torrance Art Museum has quite a bit of work, virtual work on their website, www.torranceartmuseum.com. So we support Tama, supports the TAM with your donations and your membership dues. So we thank you so much. Almost everybody on the call today is a member, and we're just so appreciative of the support that you've shown through a year where we really could not get into the museum. So we're so thankful, and we appreciate it. Let's see. Anything else to add? Anybody else? Let's see. Yes. Okay. Leslie is saying she mentioned Ellen Gallagher. And so, and Candy says, you look like a poet and a musician in this photo, Max.
Neither of which I have any talent with.
But you're a music aficionado, yes?
I love music, and I am a musical fan, but I have no talent with it at all.
So, well, we thank you all so much. And like I said, we can stay on, but if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask Max now. Otherwise, I think we're good. We hope you join us next week. We are going to try and coordinate, we'll talk with the board, and Max and the other curatorial staff at the museum, but we are going to try and get some status on what's happening at the art museum. I turned off my video, sorry. We are going to try and get some status of what's happening at the TAM, and we'll try and update everybody. Jason does a great job with his newsletter. Everybody should be getting that. If not, let us know. I usually have a link to it off of the Tama website, and I'll post it in Facebook, but not a lot of if not a lot of folks are on social media, then we'll try and get it to you any way we can to let you know what's happening and what's going on, because there is a lot going on behind the scenes at the TAM. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and let you sign off.
See you next time.
And we'll see you next time.